All right, so in the previous lecture, we looked at this pay gap that exists between male professional athletes and female professional athletes paying the same sport. And the question for us was, is this unfair? Is it unfair to be paying female athletes less than male athletes in the same sport? Or is there sufficient justification for distributing the rewards, in this case the revenue, unequally among these two groups? And we can pose this question not just about male and female athletes, but about men and women in the American workforce in general by looking at what is oftentimes referred to as the wage gap or the pay gap. The wage gap is this. Women earn approximately 80 cents for every dollar men make. Okay, and you can see the pay gap kind of as it's almost always conceptualized and represented here in this cartoon here, where we have pairs of individual men and women in a bar graph. The man is standing on top of a bar that is equivalent to $1. The woman is standing on top of a bar that's equivalent to either 59 cents in 1970 or 79 cents in 2016, and over here at some point in the future, the goal has been achieved. They're being paid the exact same amount for the exact same work. So the implication here is that there's a gap in pay that exists between men and women who are doing the same job at the same level of competency. So we might come at this issue the same way that we came at the one with the pay gap that exists between professional athletes, by asking the question, what's the cause of the pay gap, right? Is there a cause for this pay differential that would allow us to justify this unequal distribution of the rewards, of the wages here? But in this particular case, that's not the right question to ask first. The right question to ask first is, wait a minute, what exactly is the gap here that we're talking about? What is this thing that we're calling a wage gap and representing with individual men and women and their earnings? And you can see this cartoon here sort of takes the same approach, or it makes the same assumption as the cartoon did on the last slide. There's a woman here who's pointing at a framed dollar bill, and she says, and this is the first 77 cents I ever earned. And you can see here that the dollar bill has about 25% of it cut away. And the implication here is, here's this individual woman. She's done a job. She did it for pay. There is a man who did the same job with the same degree of competency. And while she was paid 77 cents for her work, he was paid $1 for his. And there's that wage gap. But this is not the way that economists are thinking about this gap when they make the claim that women earn 80 cents for every dollar that men earn. Okay? Economists think about this gap as an earnings gap, not as a gap between individual employees and their wages, but earnings of groups. Okay? So what economists do in order to make this claim that women make 80 cents up for every dollar that men make is this. They take all of the men in the workforce in a given year and they group them. And then they look at the earnings those men accrued. Then they get out a new sheet of paper and they group all of the women in the workforce and they calculate how much earnings did they accrue during that year. And when they do that, they find, okay, so for every dollar that men made, women made 80 cents. So let's say that the totality of men working in the workforce, as a group, they generated $100 worth of earnings last year. When you look over at the women generated $80 worth of earnings in that given year. And that's how economists come to this conclusion. Okay, so why am I making this distinction? I'm making this distinction because whether there's a gap between the wages of individual male and female employees, or there's a gap between the accrued earnings of all men and all women, is an important distinction, because these are different kinds of issues, different kinds of problems. And how we understand the nature of a problem is going to determine how we go about addressing that problem, if we go about addressing it at all. And we don't want to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the problem and then generate solutions that are unnecessary, or generate solutions that make the problem worse, or create new problems that we don't want to have to contend with, okay? So we want to make sure that when we're looking at this issue, of wage gaps that we don't just immediately jump towards, oh, this must be the result of sexism. If women are getting paid less than men are getting paid, that must mean that women are valued less because they are women in the workforce. Okay, because that's not necessarily what the case is here. Maybe it is, but the earnings gap is different from the wage gap. So what we have to do now is figure out, well, why is it that men collectively are generating more earnings than women collectively? What is the cause of that gap? And we might look at something like this. Here are some stats from the Bureau of Labor Statistics 2015. I probably need to update these. Back in 2015, men work 8.2 hours per day, women work 7.8 hours per day. Okay, so that doesn't seem like much, but it adds up, right? So that means that on average, men are working about 8 hours more per month than women are, okay? So why are men earning more? Well, one part of the explanation might be, well, they're earning more because they're working more. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying like, oh, look at how hardworking men are and how non-hardworking or uncommitted women are. That's not what I'm saying at all. There's a whole variety of reasons why men are working more than women. Perhaps it's that women are taking on a disproportionate amount of responsibility for the maintenance or for childcare, let's say, for example. Or let's say that men are disproportionately neglecting the time they spend with their families. There could be a whole bunch of reasons. All we know at this point is that it seems to be the case that men work more per month, per day, than women do on average. And that might be one contributing factor to this earnings gap. Now, you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, it's like, yeah, men are working more because women are expected to take more responsibility at home for the care of children and the maintenance of the house and so forth. And if that's what you're thinking, there's plenty of evidence to support that claim, right? So here you have men and women and their earnings before and after the birth of the first child. And so here up here, you can see on this blue line, here's men's earning, it's going up, birth of the first child, and lo and behold, it stays pretty much the same for the next 20 years. But look what happens to women's earnings, right? They have that first child and it just plummets down here. And then after about a year after the birth of that first child, probably after maternity leave, women start entering back into the workforce collectively. Again, we're not talking about individual women. Women enter back into the workforce or not, and their collective earnings stay down at this level. Why is that? Again, there could be a whole bunch of different reasons. Maybe all of the women who gave birth to their first child, they re-entered the workforce, but they re-entered the workforce as part-time employees. Or maybe they chose not to enter the workforce at all. Or maybe they chose to enter the workforce with a less demanding job now that they've had a child. I don't know. All we know is it seems to be the case that the birth of that first child really has an impact on the earnings of women. And you can see here on this graph that it is not the case that women without kids suffer that same salary drop, right? So their salary is a pretty consistent trajectory on the upward when they don't have kids. And for men, doesn't seem to matter if they have kids or not. Their salary trajectories are pretty much the same over time. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, yeah, but there's still this sort of unfair expectation that women are going to be taking primary responsibility for the kids and men get off free by, staying in the, fine. Yeah, that perfectly legitimate points. We're trying to understand, though, what's the cause of the earnings differential. And it does seem to be the case that one of the factors that's playing into this is the birth of children, okay? So now we come back to the original question. All right, so knowing this, and there's a whole bunch of other factors as well, right? Men disproportionately take on very risky jobs that pay very well, like working on oil refineries in the Middle East and so forth. Men are much more willing, disproportionately much more willing to travel as a part of their job. There's a whole bunch of variables like this that may contribute to this earnings differential. What we want to know is the distribution of rewards, in this case earnings, in the form of money, and sacrifices, primary caretaker, justifiable? Okay, and so there's three different approaches that we could take to this. One is, I'm going to look at this and other ethical problems through the lens of equality of opportunity of merit. In other words, I'm going to look at the situation and I'm going to ask myself, do men and women have the same opportunities to either enter into the workforce or stay at home and be the primary caretaker of children? And the answer in America is, well, yes. We don't have laws, unlike some countries. We don't have laws that attempt to compel men to leave the workforce and be primary caretakers, or compel women back into the workforce. We allow we allow people to make that choice freely, and we allow that choice to be made by men and women equally. And so therefore, because there's an equal playing field of opportunity here, if we take this perspective, we might say, like, look, if this is the case that the people in the workforce have the same opportunity to perform the same amount of work, then the people that perform the most of it the best should be compensated appropriately. And that might be the conclusion that we come to as a way of kind of justifying this. It's like, look, men are working more, therefore men are going to earn more in the workforce. On the other hand, we could approach this through the lens of equity or equality of outcome and say, look, there are groups of women, there's a group of women, there's a group of men who are in the workforce, and there is an unequal earnings between these two groups. We want to equalize them. So now we have to solve this problem. Maybe what we'll do is we'll create incentives or for men to more often be the primary caretaker in their homes. Or maybe what we'll do is we'll create a special tax on people who don't have kids so that they pay salaries to the primary caretakers who are staying home and staying out of the workforce to take care of those kids. Or maybe we create disincentives for women to be the primary caretakers of children or men to stay in the workforce. That was the approach that some of the Scandinavian countries took with regards to this and a number of other issues, and had the exact opposite effect. It's very interesting. If you want to look that up, it's called the Scandinavian paradox. It's really kind of mind-blowing. All right. Or we could finally take this sort of teleological approach. It's like, well, what's the purpose of work? What's the purpose of child rearing? And we could sort of go down this road and figure out, what's the nature of the solution that we should be looking for, if any?